as you're a black man, you're an African. No mind your nationality, you have got the identity of an African.
I'm a Nigerian. I was born in Nigeria. My parents are from Nigeria, and I'm an African.
I consider myself a West Indian. I'm from Jamaica, West Indies, basically because that's where all of my heritage, as far as my immediate family, grandmother and aunts, my mother, my father, myself, were born and raised.
I am an African, a person of African descent. We as black people in this country must realize that we have a homeland and we have a motherland. Just because we have been here for a certain amount of time does not negate this fact. I likened it to you cannot put kittens in the oven and come out biscuits. Just because we were brought here does not make us particularly American. We are African people.
I am African. I just happened to be born in Brazil. It was not my choice. I mean, my people was taken there for 100 years ago or so, and we have been enslaved. But I consider all blacks in the world Africans, and I am African.
Regardless of where black people are born, whether in Africa, America, Europe, or Asia, they are Africans. If you are black, you are African. But the relationship between Africans on the continent and African descendants in the diaspora is not as good as it should be.
Between true Africans and African descendants, unfortunately, there's no relationship. It seems like Black Americans, Afro-Americans, or Americans do not want to associate themselves with Africans, and Africans really don't want to associate themselves with Black Americans. They don't see the correlation. They don't see the bind where we've come up from the same. We are all the same, brothers and sisters. But unfortunately, that's not the way it's perceived, as far as in my opinion.
Actually, the relationship is not as close as I would have expected, because I consider blacks all over the world to be the same. And sometimes you find some kind of a line being drawn between Africans that come from, Black Americans in particular, between foreigners, maybe from all parts of Africa. I would have expected that maybe they will accept other Africans exactly as they, see themselves too.
I noticed, especially here on campus, especially Africans, have a tendency to stick together more than socialize with Americans here. And they don't consider us to be, maybe they don't consider us to be true descendants. Okay, because I noticed they have a tendency to stick together more than socializing and mixing with the rest of us over here.
According to the dissertation by Dr. Isaac Ayodeji, published in 1976 on the topic Attitudes Toward Africa, a comparative study of the degree of Pan-Africanism among Howard University students, showed that isolation tends to reinforce ethnocentrism among African students and their African American counterparts. This conflict is manifested more in students with a medium level of identification with Africa rather than with students who strongly identify with Africa or students who do not identify with their homeland at all.
The relationship between, say, the Africans, the Caribbeans are fine, meaning we do intermingle, we do speak, we do transact, and so on and so forth. As far as the Africans and the Afro-Americans here, meaning the Americans, the brought-up Americans, and their relationship, from what I have perceived, is very raw. It's just not good at all. They preach how they want to be, they relate with Africa, and they relate with the West Indies, and someone in their great-grandmother's great-grandmother is from Jamaica, and the other one is from Antigua, and so on and so forth. And how they're Africa, 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 but yet say, well, would you like to go out to dinner with Africa? No. Well, why? Because they smell.
Presently, I think that the relationships between Africans and Afro-Americans are steadily becoming closer and better. And, I think that basically for Black Americans, that is because, they're becoming more and more aware of their closeness and kinship as far as the different nationalities are concerned, under the black diaspora as it's called.
Well, I think the present relationship is good. I'm not going to say excellent. I'm going to say good. This is a tremendous advance over where they were poor, because I would say in the 40s, the relationships were poor. Now here we are at the beginning of the 80s, and they are good. Starting in the 60s, they were fair. They moved from fair, but with the effort of a number of people, they are now at the point where I think the relationships are good. And I say this because there is no way that a Trans-Africa could have been successful in the 50s. And when one looks at the success that Trans-Africa has achieved in its short existence, and when one looks at the leadership position that Trans-Africa has assumed on the African question, and that the national consensus that it is building and receiving, and that the congressional support that it is receiving, and its influence even on the White House, right? And when one looks at the broad spectrum of support that we are getting, not only from blacks, black Americans, Africans, but from progressive thinking non-blacks, then I think we have made tremendous progress, though not as much as we hope to make in the future.
As brothers and sisters, there should be mutual relationships between Africans and African descendants. But many factors contributed to the division among African people all over the world.
You can go all the way back to the separation, like a mother a child from his mother. You separate, take a mother away from his child, and you see them 16, 30, 40 years later, and that feeling in the heart that you might know this is my mom, but you won't have that feeling, that love for her as you would as if you had come up together. I think it's the separation that happened years ago.
First of all, you have a cultural gap. I mean, it is true that people of African descent and Africans have a community of race they belong to in terms of color or whatever. But there is the reality of cultural difference. And I think cultural differences do create tension. And people who are not sensitive enough to cultural differences and make the necessary arrangements to understand peoples of different culture are likely to create greater tension between peoples of Africa and peoples of African descent.
The cultural differences between Africans in the continent and Africans in the diaspora is not so great. So it's not culture in and of itself that is a reason for any of the difficulties that we may be having in terms of relating to each other. I think there's a good deal more similarity and unity amongst the cultures of African peoples, wherever they are, on the continent or the diaspora, than there are differences. And certainly those differences are not antagonistic. It is only when we begin to see the economic interests as they are manipulated by other people that we begin to get the differences, or the economic manipulation of those cultural differences by other people, other non-Africans, that we begin to see that cultural differences may or seem to cause some differences or some difficulty. But other than that, culture in and of itself between Africans on the continent and abroad, no, that's not a fundamental reason for any difficulty or differences.
Another area of tension is the lack of understanding about individual human beings. I mean, this is not something cultural, this is passional. I mean, if you do not try to understand your fellow man, even from the same culture, you're going to have a greater problem dealing with people across cultures. So you're going to have cultural differences plus personal idiosyncrasies combined to create tension between the African from the continent and the person of African descent living in the diaspora.
When we talk about relationships and values associated with relationships, we can't, in any means, disassociate it from the source of information. And of course, the media, the communications industry, is the primary source of information. The primary source of information. So information, as it is transmitted by, those monopoly enterprises of Western media, of course, are then going to shape very much the values and the way that people relate to each other, particularly Africans. So that communications industry information that is transmitted is fundamental to our problem.
I think U.S. centrism is very restrictive in this sense. And also the language barrier and the concept that Brazil is backwards, Brazil is third world, Africa is third world, keeps Afro-Americans in this pretentious superiority. And we would have to deal with that mind pattern. We'd have to change that pattern of thinking about Africans in the diaspora.
In the introduction of Linda Kumi's master thesis entitled A Scale for the Measurement of Afro-American Attitudes Toward Continental Africans, published in 1974, she mentioned that the present tension between Africans and African Americans started a long time ago, when African students first came to the United States.
When African students came to the United States, sometimes they were told to stay out of African American affairs, and African Americans, on the other hand, felt that that Africans were from the dark continent and did not want to be associated with Afro Americans.
In addition to that, Mr. Leo Edwards, founder of the Caribbean American Intercultural Organization, recalls some of his experiences when he first came to the United States that led to further division between Africans and African Americans.
All entertainment was confined to U Street, the theaters that one could attend, the restaurants that one could attend, the nightclubs that one could attend were all on U Street. Below U Street, if you went, you could go and shop, but you couldn't eat. If you went into a little store beyond U Street, down 7th Street, and you wanted to buy a Coke, you had to take it outside. And they had signs up there saying, niggers, Jews, and dogs not allowed. And you couldn't go to a theater downtown. Now, one of the problems involved with that, some West Indians, Caribbean people coming in, and Africans, were so upset by this new knowledge that they resented it. And it turned out that if you produced your passport saying you were British, you would sometimes be admitted, say, to a theater. Now, some foreigners, Africans and Caribbean peoples, in their indignance, produced a passport and were admitted. And naturally, this caused resentment among their Black American friends. So we too contributed to some of those problems, not because we intended to, but being indignant at that time, they reacted in ways that were not entirely sensible.
Although many barriers have been created to prevent understanding among Africans on the continent and Africans in the diaspora, Dr. Suleiman Yang, director of the African Studies Department at Howard University, gives some insight on how the relationship can be improved.
One is to have an open mind with regard to the other human being you are dealing with. In this case, you are dealing with a fellow Black or person of African descent. Secondly, you must go beyond that personal attitude of openness to interact with others, but you must also take the time to learn the truth about other cultures, and in this case, cultures from parts of the Pan-African world, i.e. Africa and the Caribbean, or South America, or Canada, or in Britain, where you have blacks living in Britain. The third thing that needs to be done, in addition to the attitude change and the receptivity to ideas and correct information about places and things, one must also be willing to commingle with other peoples from other parts of the world, and in this particular case, people from Africa and the Caribbean, so as to begin to understand these people not only at the theoretical level, but also at the practical level, as fellow humans on a person-to-person basis. But once the individual takes the initiative and is able to carry through such a program of action, I am confident that we will begin to see a larger number of people who are not only educated about Africa, but are also very well informed about the Pan-African world.
Think you where you come from. As long as you're a black man, you're an African. No man